Welcome to Canadian Coffee House Crime. My name is Catherine. I right now am residing in the city of Winnipeg. I grew up here and it's nice to see a familiar place for a few weeks. I'm going to visit some family, check out the painted turn-of-the-century buildings, and hit up the best burger I've ever had. And I've tried burgers in every province across this country, and this burger can be found at Dairy Whip. Please try this burger if you're ever in town. Skip the dishes, it's never tasted so good. Yes, that's right. No more Haunted Canada from the Canadian Mint coin and stamp collection. So now for something completely different. The first serial killer of Winnipeg. His name was Earl Leonard Nelson, aka the Gorilla Strangler, aka the Dark Strangler. Earl Leonard Nelson is also known as the first American serial sex killer of the 20th century. Okay, here we go. This is a dark one. Earl Nelson was born Earl Leonard Farrell on May 12, 1897, and lived in San Francisco, California. He was the only child and son of an English mother. Her name was Frances Nelson, and apparently she was quite young when Earl was born. Earl's father, who was Spanish, was named James Farrell, about whom even less is known. Nelson was orphaned at 9 months of age when his mother died from syphilis, contracted from his father, and his father also died from syphilis 6 months after his wife. Earl was sent to live with his grandparents, Lars and Jenny Nelson. The Nelsons lived a Puritan lifestyle and sought to repress emotions, feelings, and especially sexual desires. Earl's grandmother was a distant woman, overworked and weary. She genuinely cared for her grandson, but from an early age he was a difficult child. He was at times hyperactive and other times profoundly depressed. Growing up, he cared little for hygiene and manners, despite his grandmother's attempts to raise a God-fearing young gentleman. The other children in the home, Willis and Lillian, who were 10 and 8 years his senior, began taunting him and calling him an animal. This, combined with the huge difference in their ages, distanced him from the other children in the home. More than once, an irate shopkeeper who had caught Earl stealing trivial items from his store summoned his grandmother. Nelson experienced self-loathing and other morbid behavior at a young age and was expelled from the Agassiz Primary School in San Francisco at age 7. He was described as quiet and morbid. He was a withdrawn, moody little kid with bizarre personal habits. One of his odd habits was that he would go to school each day in neat, laundered clothes and return absolutely disgusting, as though he swapped clothes with a homeless person. His behavior patterns became even more twisted after, at the age of 10, while playing in the street, he was struck by a trolley that clipped the back of his bike and dragged him 50 feet. The accident left him comatose for 6 days. He bled profusely from a hole in his temple, and the doctors didn't think he was going to live. After he awoke, Nelson's behavior became erratic, and he suffered from frequent headaches and memory loss, with a hole in his temple resulting in dizziness that grew progressively worse. Near the end of his life, Nelson suffered from pain so severe that he was sometimes unable to walk. Aside from headaches, there were other side effects from Nelson's accident. His moods grew more oppressive, and he would have manic periods where he would walk on his hands or lift heavy chairs with his teeth. Described as a psychotic prodigy, he would talk to invisible people, compulsively quoting biblical passages, Nelson's strong religious upbringing remained a persuasive influence in his life, and he obsessively read the book of Revelation as a teenager, underlying numerous passages, but also shocked his aunt by talking smut and spying on his female cousin Rachel as she stripped for bed. When not preoccupied with voyeurism or the scriptures, Nelson spent his time in basements, relishing in the solitude and darkness. When Nelson was 14, his grandmother died, and Nelson went to live with his aunt, Lillian, and her husband. 10 years his senior, Lillian was genuinely fond of her nephew, and like her mother, tended to overlook his eccentricities. Family to her was all important up until the end. She stuck by her nephew despite his heinous crimes. One of his most peculiar habits was his style of eating. At dinner, he would drench his food in olive oil, put his face to the plate, and slurp up his meal like a caged beast at feeding time, much to the disgust of his table mates, his Uncle William and Aunt Lillian. As a young man, Nelson was a daydreamer and a compulsive masturbator. Earl passed through a series of menial jobs. A 1 or 2 month stint at a job was a long stretch for the young man whose work ethic was severely lacking. He would rarely finish an assigned task, and he often just wandered off work site, never to return. Just as he has as a young boy, he never outgrew his rough temper, and although she loved her nephew as a family, Lillian was clearly afraid of the teen. He began frequenting the prostitutes near Fisherman's Wharf at the age of 15. Nelson began frequenting brothels and bars in San Francisco's Barbary Coast red light district and contracted a venereal disease. Blood tests showed evidence of gonorrhea and syphilis, which Nelson said he contracted before his 16th birthday. As he progressed through puberty, Nelson grew into a stocky, physically fit young man. Earl Nelson began drinking heavily, often disappearing for days at a time on alcoholic binges. He spent his money, whatever he didn't turn over to his aunt for room and board, on the most sensational and lurid literature of the day, and his descent into madness accelerated. Aunt Lillian, now raising 2 children of her own, as well as her mentally ill nephew, had given up trying to discipline the hulking teen and wavered between wanting Earl just to move out and her misguided protective nature toward her kin. From his unknown but obvious illicit sources of income, Earl was a strong financial contributor to the household, albeit one whose lifestyle habits were undoubtedly more trouble than they were worth. Unable to openly confront her nephew, Lillian acted to protect her children as much as possible, but prayed for help to solve her familiar problem. In 1915, and in need of money and food, Earl broke into what he thought was an abandoned cabin, only to be surprised on his way out by the returning owner. He fled into the nearby woods, but was tracked down by a posse and arrested. Caught red-handed, it was an open and shut case, and Earl was quickly tried and convicted of burglary. Earl was sentenced to 2 years in prison and sent to San Quentin prison. He was paroled for his offense on September 6, 1916, but was arrested again in Stockton on March 9, 1917, for petty larceny. Nelson spent another 6 months incarcerated before being discharged, after which he was arrested in Los Angeles for burglary charges. After spending approximately 5 months in the Los Angeles County Jail, Nelson escaped. America had just gone into World War I when Nelson got out of prison. He enlisted in the Navy but refused to do anything but lie on his cot and rant about the great beast of Revelations. Sometimes in late 1917, Nelson enlisted in the U.S. military but deserted after 6 weeks. He repeated this pattern on several occasions, enlisting in different military branches under different names before deserting. In 1918, Nelson was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital after behaving oddly and erratically during one of his brief stints in the United States Navy. A Navy psychologist noted that Nelson was living in a constitutional psychotic state. Upon his arrival at Napa State Mental Hospital, a psychologist who observed Nelson on May 21st, 1918, noted that he did not appear violent, homicidal, or destructive. William Pritchard, a psychiatrist who conducted a preliminary interview with him, noted that Nelson spoke of hallucinations and other paranoid delusions. He has seen faces, heard music, and at times believed people were poisoning him. Voices sometimes whispered to him to kill himself. Says that if he were kept in jail, he would get something sharp and cut the veins in his wrists. Pritchard also indicated that Nelson had experienced occipital headaches, which are shock-like headaches caused by nerve damage on the scalp. He fainted several times and felt dizzy during their interactions. During his institutionalization, Nelson managed to escape at least 3 times before staff eventually stopped trying to locate him. His frequent escapes earned him the nickname Houdini among the hospital's employees. Nelson was formally discharged from the Navy in absentia on May 17, 1919, and his file with the hospital was closed with a note indicating he had improved. Nelson subsequently acquired a job working as a janitor at St. Mary's Hospital. At one point, Nelson fell from a ladder at work. The second head injury caused vision issues, voices, and more mental problems. There he met 60-year-old Mary Martin, an administrative worker. The two began to date and were married in August 1919. He was 22. She was 38 years his senior. Their marriage, however, was short-lived as Nelson made her life a living hell. He had jealous rage, bizarre sexual demands, religious delusions, and increasing violent behavior, leading her to separate from him after cohabiting for only 6 months. Mary Martin would recall later various bizarre behaviors she witnessed while living with Nelson, which included long disappearances from their home and unusual bathing practices that entailed him pouring glasses of water over his toes. Shortly after she left him on May 19, 1921, Nelson posed as a plumber to enter the residence at 1519 Pacific Avenue in San Francisco, where he was going to rob the place but ended up attempting to molest 12-year-old resident Mary Summers in the basement. His attempt was thwarted when she screamed and attracted help from her elder brother. Nelson fled but was captured hours later while riding a trolley. It didn't take long for Nelson's bizarre behavior to shock his jailers. On his first evening in jail, he plucked his eyebrows completely with just his fingernails and began howling about seeing faces on the wall. Earl was brought before a judge to determine his legal competency. Psychiatrists wrote that Nelson was apathetic, eccentric, noisy, destructive, and a bit of a firebug. Further, the doctors examined and warned that Earl Nelson was restless, violent, dangerous, excited, and depressed. He was dangerous, the doctors warned to his wife and self. Their conclusion was that Earl was so far disordered in his mind to endanger the health in person. Whereupon the judge filed the commitment order, writing that he was dangerous to be at large. Earl was transported that very day back to the Napa State Hospital, the place he had escaped from 3 times already. At the hospital, he threatened to kill the medical staff, and doctors recommended that he stay there permanently, but rather than sit there and wait out the rest of his life, Nelson quickly escaped from the hospital on 2 occasions before discharge from the institution in 1925. The next year of Nelson's life are lost, but sometime in the interim between his flight and reappearance, Nelson made the move from sexual assault to homicide. In 16 months, from February 1926 to June 1927, he claimed at least 22 victims, preying chiefly on widows and spinsters who took in a mild-mannered boarder impressed by his manners, his smile, and the Bible he carried. On February 20th, 1926, Earl rented rooms from Clara Newman, 6 years old, in San Francisco. She was strangled and sexually assaulted the same day. She was found in the attic of her rooming house. She had been displaying a rooms to let sign in her downstairs window. Earl Nelson had come to inquire about one. Earl Leonard Nelson would look for women advertising rooms to rent. Nelson would look at the room with the landlady. Once alone inside the room with her, he would strangle her. He would sexually assault the corpse and hide the body. Starting in San Francisco and working his way up the coast to Seattle, he headed eastward. In his wake, the paper dubbed him the Gorilla Man because of the animal savagery of his attacks. Nelson was also an odd-looking man, with a receding forehead, protruding lips, and huge hands. Police began to think that he was like a real-life version of Edgar Allan Poe's Rue Morgue murderer. This killer was inhuman. No normal human had the might to strangle a healthy, middle-aged woman to death and handle the bodies in the way this killer did, the police and newspapers surmised. Only a specter could slip in and out of populated areas like this maniac, and only a monster would do the things to the dead that this killer seemed to enjoy doing. Following the identical murder of 60-year-old Laura Beale in San Jose, newsmen began writing stories about the dark strangler, but their suspect remained elusive. On June 10th, Nelson was back in San Francisco, where he sexually assaulted and strangled Lily St. Mary, 63, stuffing her body under a bed. Ollie Russell, 58, was the next to die in Santa Barbara on June 24th. On August 16th, Mary Nesbitt suffered an identical fate in Oakland. California had become too hot for Nelson. On October 19th, Beta Withers, 35, was sexually assaulted and strangled. Her remains deposited inside a trunk. Her 15-year-old son found her. Next day, October 20th, Nelson killed Virginia Grant and left her corpse behind the furnace in a house that she advertised for rent. October 21st found Nelson in the company of Mabel Fluke. Her body, strangled with a scarf, was found inside the attic of her home. Police in Portland finally identified their man, but finding him was something else entirely. Nelson struck again in San Francisco on November 18th, strangling the wife of William Edmonds. On November 24th, he strangled Blanche Mayers in Oregon City, tucking her body beneath a bed in her rooming house. As police dragnets rendered the West Coast uninhabitable, Nelson moved eastward, hitchhiking and riding the rails. In Council Bluffs, Iowa, on December 23rd, he killed Mrs. Elmira Berard, another landlady. Settling in Kansas City for Christmas, December 25th, he strangled 23-year-old Bonnie Pace. Rebounding on December 28th with the double murder of Germania Harpin and her 8-month-old daughter. On April 27th, 1927, Nelson strangled Mary McConnell, age 60, in Philadelphia. A month later, in May 1927, in Buffalo, New York, the victim was Jenny Randolph, 35. Moving on to Detroit, he murdered landlady Fannie Mae and one of her tenants, Mrs. M.C. Atworthy, on June 1st. 2 days later, he strangled Mary Seetzor, 27, in Chicago. Nelson feared police were closing in on him by now and made a move to save himself that ultimately brought him to the gallows. On June 8, 1927, Nelson crossed over the border into Canada and hitchhiked to Winnipeg, where he took a room in a boarding house on 133rd Smith Street. Here Nelson broke his pattern and the landlady was unharmed. Instead, Nelson murdered 14-year-old Lolo Cowan and, as part of a regular formula, hid her body under a bed in a spare room where it was found 4 days later. On June 9, 1927, William Patterson arrived home to find his wife Emily missing and later to discover a suitcase rifled and money stolen from it. Fearing the worst, Patterson telephoned the police, anxious over his wife's whereabouts, but no accidents had been reported. A religious man, Patterson knelt by his bed to pray for strength before retiring, and that is when he found his wife. who had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death before being pushed under her own bed. It was calculated that Mrs. Patterson had been killed at approximately 11 o'clock that morning. Shortly afterwards, Nelson walked into a second-hand clothes shop where he sold items from the Pattersons. Spending his cash on a haircut, he aroused suspicion when the barber noticed dried blood in his hair. Recognized for his wanted poster in a local post office, Nelson was picked up and jailed at Killarney. Earl told the police after his arrest, "I only do my lady killings on Saturday nights." He escaped after picking the lock on his cell with a nail file. 2 days later, he was heading back to the United States, but that 48 hours had given the Canadian police time enough to circulate a detailed description of Nelson, and he was recognized at a post office in Wacopa. When Nelson himself walked in, Nelson was recaptured. On November 1st, 1927, Nelson was tried at Winnipeg before Mr. Justice Dysart for the murder of Emily Patterson. In addition to his 22 known murders, Nelson was also the leading suspect in a triple murder in Newark, New Jersey during 1926. The victims included Rose Valentine and Margaret Stanton, both strangled, along with Laura Tidor, shot to death when she attempted to defend them from their killer. Nelson pleaded insanity as a defense, in which he was greatly supported by testimony from Aunt Lillian and his former wife, but after a 4-day trial, he was found guilty, and on January 13, 1928, Nelson was hanged at the Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg at 7:30 a.m. Before the trap was sprung, he told his spectators, "I am innocent. I stand innocent before God and man. I forgive those who have wronged me and ask forgiveness of those I have injured. God have mercy." Earl struggled for over 11 minutes after his hanging begun. This is a list of Earl Nelson's known victims. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Catherine, and this is Canadian Coffee House Crime. And this concludes Story 1 from Winnipeg, Manitoba. See you in the next case.